everybody, welcome back to another episode of Shifty's 49ers Talk. In today's video, I am going to go over some players who I believe their stock is rising from training camp to the preseason game, and then also some players who I believe their stock is dropping, unfortunately. There is a lot to talk about, guys, so let's not waste any time, and let's get to it. Let's kick it off with the players whose stock I believe is rising. And the first guy that I want to talk about is going to be offensive lineman Ilm Manning. Now, he's an undrafted free agent out of Hawaii. There's a couple of really good content creators online, and they've broken down his play from the preseason game against the Raiders, and he's looked really, really impressive. Something that's also going to help him out is that a lot of our offensive linemen struggled in that game. He was not one of them, so that's really going to help him separate himself from that, and maybe there's an outside shot that he could make the 53-man roster. At worst, he'll be destined for the practice squad. Hopefully another team doesn't pick him up, but hopefully he continues his really good performance. He showed good athleticism, really good technique, and just held up really well, which is not something that I can say for many of the offensive linemen in that preseason game. Now, if we move on to the next player, it's also going to be a rookie, and that's going to be the main focus here in terms of the players whose stock is rising, and that's wide receiver Ronnie Bell. You know, it's one of those things where a 7th round pick at wide receiver on a team that's loaded with talent at the position like the 49ers are, you think there'd be an outside shot at him making that roster, but I think he's looking better than ever. Had a really solid game against the Raiders, not only, 3 receptions, 58 yards, had the nice run, showed some decent kick return ability. Unfortunately, he had that drop that led to the interception, but I think 99 times out of 100, he hauls that in, and that would have been another 20, 30-yard game. So overall, really, really good game there from Ronnie Bell, and I think his stock is rising to the point where, if he can continue this on, he'll be a near lock for the 53-man roster. Now, moving on to the defensive side of the ball, and player whose stock is rising, in my opinion, is Clelin Ferrell. Drake Jackson has been out for the last couple of weeks with an injury, and Clelin Ferrell has really taken this opportunity to show what he can do to maybe potentially be the starter opposite Nick Bosa come week 1. He, in my opinion, was our best defender on the field against the Las Vegas Raiders in the preseason game. If he can continue that, I don't see any reason why he won't be the starter week 1 at Pittsburgh. Now, moving on to another player who I've always been a big fan of, and that's going to be Ambry Thomas. Had a really nice game against the Raiders, been starting to get a little bit of work with the ones in training camp, so that's a really good sign. It's one of those things where, a player that we're going to talk about has seemingly struggled a little bit in the slot, so maybe Lenore moves there, Ambry Thomas outside, but Ambry Thomas at the very least should provide good depth for the 49ers at cornerback, and that's a position where we saw in 2021 a number of injuries. That was a major difficulty in terms of that position that year. Having quality depth, always really important. Great to see Ambry Thomas bounce back after just an invisible year in 2022. Last couple of players I'm going to talk about very quickly who I think their stock is rising and they're really trying to make their case for the 53-man roster are the 2 rookie linebackers. We have D. Winters, Jalen Graham, especially Jalen Graham, really just trusting his instincts, making a nice tackle in the backfield. D. Winters showing off his athleticism. The Niners do a great job scouting linebackers, and this could be another case where a couple of late picks, that could be really good depth, not only this year, but moving forward. I really, really like how those guys have been playing. And overall, I think you just have to be encouraged, especially on the defensive side. A lot of good things that we've seen. And, upon further reflection of that Raiders game, which was a bit of a disaster. It's only preseason, and what we're looking for is some of those players who stand out and can maybe get themselves onto the 53-man roster. But unfortunately, coming up next, we're going to talk about some players who I think stock is plummeting, and we're going to get right into that. Let's now move on to the players whose stock I believe is dropping, unfortunately. Never a fun thing to talk about, but it is something that's important that we address, I believe, on this channel. So the first player I don't think will be any surprise to anyone, and that's going to be rookie tight end Cameron Latu, 3rd round pick out of Alabama. Now, since he's really gotten here and since training camp has kicked off, I think there's been some decent reports, showing an ability to get open in training camp, but unfortunately that's followed up with a bad case of the drops. never a good thing right there. You look at the preseason game, wasn't given a ton of opportunities in the passing game, but he did make a catch, did a solid job fighting for a couple of extra yards, but then coughed up the ball. Raiders get the ball immediately in our own red zone. So you're really hoping that Cameron Latou, as a third-round pick, can step up a little bit more in the next preseason game against the Broncos, then against the Chargers in the third preseason game. I think the way things are going, I can't imagine the 49ers cutting Cameron Latou. It's just too early to give up on a third-round pick. So I believe he'll be on the 53-man roster, but also going to make the assumption that as of now, at least, I can't imagine him being active on game days. So what can he do? Of course, look, work the jugs machine. You got to hold on to the ball, especially in those key parts of the field. But another big thing is if he can really show, and he has the size for this, show a great ability or a good ability to be a solid blocker, and maybe he can fill in that Charlie Werner type role, or if we look back to 2019, maybe a Levine Toilolo type role where you have that blocker, and maybe a few times within the year you kind of sprinkle in, looks like he's going to block, then maybe he peels out, no one picks him up, bam, big game. I think the book is clearly not written on a guy like Cameron Latou. I think he's got so much promise, and traditionally it does take tight ends a lot of time to adjust to the NFL game. You got to basically do the job of an offensive lineman and also a wide receiver. The good thing though is I think he has the size for the block, and he definitely has the personality for it. He's shown an ability to get open. If he can just reel in those catches, and let's not forget, a guy like Jamar Chase, his rookie year, couldn't catch a thing in training camp or preseason. Of course, before anyone freaks out, I'm not saying he's anywhere going to be near the level of like a guy like Jamar Chase, a wide receiver, but sometimes it can take some guys a little bit longer to acclimate to the NFL game, and maybe they're just a little bit of nerves, things of that nature. But I'd like to see Cameron Latou, of course, improve and really be an effective player on this roster. Now, moving on, the next couple of guys I'm going to talk about here are going to be a couple of offensive linemen. It's going to be left guard Jason Poe and right guard Nick Zakelj. Both of these guys against the Raiders struggled mightily. There was a number of plays where we saw Jason Poe block basically nobody, which led to a run going nowhere, led to an immediate pressure on the quarterback. Same thing could be said for Nick Zakelj. He did attempt to block a couple of players, and it did not go well. Looked pretty darn bad. Led to a couple of cases where Trey Lance gets the ball from the snap and is immediately got to dodge defenders. Not a good look. And, also in that game, the run game really struggled early on. Can't blame, Poe and Zakelj for all of it, but they, I think, are a significant portion of the blame, especially early on, those drives, with Trey Lance that the blocking, seemed inconsistent, and I think it led to Trey also really not trusting it, and if he felt any kind of pressure, he's like, I got to get out of the pocket. So both of these guys, look, they're in their second year. Nick Zakelj, a later round pick out of Fordham, Jason Poe, an undrafted free agent out of Mercer, small schools, late picks are undrafted. It's going to take them a while. There's a reason why they went where they went, but I do think, and it's going to take time for them to develop. I'd like to see them maybe step up a little bit more moving forward, get off this stock dropping, part of the video, and just show them maybe earn a spot on the 53-man roster, or at least be effective depth on the practice squad that should we suffer injuries, we can basically promote them to the 53-man roster and have some level of confidence should they have to step in and play some snaps. I think they're both capable of doing it, but so far from what we saw in that game, it's not looking good. You have to say their stock is dropping. Now, moving on to the defensive side of the ball, and one of the guys, in my opinion, whose stock is dropping is Javon Kinlaw. And the reason why I say that is, look, he's had a really tough career so far with injuries, primarily. Hasn't really lived up, of course, to his billing as a top half of the first round pick, but a lot of great reports out of training camp. He's looking in great shape and his get off is really impressive. So I was hoping to see, I don't want to necessarily say a dominant performance in preseason because he didn't play the full game, but make a couple of really big impact plays. He did have one nice play where he disrupted a run, which really just led the Raiders having a run that went nowhere. However, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more, just because he was going up against the Raiders' second unit offensive line. So when it comes to, the regular season, when he's out there, he's going to be up against guys who are a whole lot better than that. he will be part of the rotation on the defensive line. You know, it's one of those things where last year I feel like we really counted on Javon Kinlaw making a big step, and the benefit of bringing in a guy like Javon Hargrave is that we no longer have to rely on Kinlaw to really be, you know, to live up to his draft status. So I think it's a good thing. Javon Kinlaw is in a contract year. We did not pick up the 5th-year option, so he's going to really have to prove himself in somewhat limited snaps because he'll be part of the rotation just to show what he can do to maybe earn a big contract elsewhere next offseason. You know, I really want to say that I have faith and hope that he can do it. You can't put too much stock into a preseason game, just, you know, and he didn't play the full game, so maybe I'm overreacting a little bit, but if he can show some things in the next couple of games before the regular season, I'll definitely feel a whole lot better about the defensive line depth. And now the last guy that I want to talk about is also going to be on the defensive side of the ball. That's going to be nickelback Isaiah Oliver. Now, we brought him in free agency. Steve Wilks, our new defensive coordinator, this was a guy that he really targeted and really wanted to add to this defense. Now, it was presumed, you know, he got a 2-year deal, $2.6 million guaranteed, that he would just slot in and be the slot cornerback and just, you know, given the starting job. Now, the performance against the Raiders wasn't great. A number of times his coverage really broke down, and we've seen it in training camp in recent reports in recent days that they've been really, you know, Steve Wilks, the defensive coaching staff, have been mixing up different personnel, maybe moving Lenore into the slot. You have, you know, Womack or you have Ambry Thomas out wide. So it's no longer a given that Isaiah Oliver will be the starter. And that to me is disappointing. That to me is stock dropping. Essentially, when we looked at when he was signed, we just assumed he would be the starter. And now that, you know, it could still very well be the case, and maybe he bounces back. But right now, that is coming into doubt and into question, so that's why he's moving down in terms of stock going down, in my books at least, but still, again, plenty of time to fix that now. So there you have it, guys, for my video for players who I believe stock is rising and falling. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If there are some guys that I didn't talk about that you think I should have, if you agree with me, if you disagree with me, always good to get a good conversation going in the comments below. And if you enjoy the content, do consider liking the video, sharing the video on social media, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. But I'm going to get out of here. But before I do, you know I'm going to say 2 things. And the butt counts. And I'll catch you guys on the flip side.